BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Hello and welcome to another episode of the BlomCast dealing with changing points in history, tipping points in history, moments in which something happens to which whole societies have to react. Something, for instance, as a climate emergency. That's not the first time that this has happened. And today I want to look at the last time a climate emergency forced societies to change, and this is the third part of a three-part series looking at the so-called Little Ice Age. Let's quickly recap and see what actually happened and what we are talking about. Well, sometime in the Middle Ages, in the late Middle Ages, the world got a lot colder, the earth got a lot colder by 2 degrees, a familiar number, I think. And this wobble in temperatures then was not due to human activity, at least not according to the modern scientific consensus. It seems to have had something to do with a natural variation in the activity of the sun. But the result was that societies embedded in the landscapes they are in and in the nature they are in had to change dramatically as nature changed. I have looked at this in the case of Europe, not because Europe is the only thing that's important, but because the records we have for that time in Europe are especially abundant. And so we can see not only what happened, that scientists can reconstruct anywhere on Earth, but we can also see how societies reacted, who adapted well, who didn't, etc. So what happened in Europe? Well, in the 1400s or so, temperatures broke to a new low, and societies were very badly hit. These were agricultural societies. They were reliant on local agricultural product to survive, and all of a sudden this agricultural produce was scarce because there were many ruined harvests. The winters were bitter cold and much longer than usually. That also means that the vegetation period that the plants have to ripen was much shorter in summer, that the summers were short and rainy and cold, and farmers saw their own harvests rot still in the field. And you can imagine what that did to agricultural societies. It meant that in the countryside there was hunger and there was desperation. But in the city, where the grain prices were what would be the gold standard in the 19th century, so the one standard price that sets all the other prices, well, in the city there was an inflation of up to 100%. And so there was social uproar, social unrest really everywhere, and society no longer seemed to work. I say society no longer seemed to work, but what really no longer seemed to work was the contract that societies had with their God. And this is, I think, something very important, because we are talking here about narratives. And the narrative that God gave his creatures from his abundance in return effectively for veneration and for respect for his laws and for prayers, this contract all of a sudden seemed to be broken because nature no longer gave as abundantly as it had done before. Now, this is the moment that's really important, because the question is, how did societies react? And, well, they reacted as a medieval society would. They prayed, they had processions, they flagellated themselves, they carried up relics to glaciers to make them stop, and after every harvest in Central Europe there was a wave of witch trials and witch burnings, and witches were always accused of having spoiled the harvest. So how effective was that? Not very effective. And in the second of this episode I have told you what were the first what were the first really effective changes people made, societies made. And the first effective changes were, for instance, grain trade, and Amsterdam was very important there by trading with grain, which had not been so common because grain was grown locally. But now, by trading with grain across Europe, you could even out some of the shortages. But at the same time, of course, money became much more important. Trading cities became much more important. Markets became much more important. And we see a change in these societies as they begin to adapt to climate change. Another adaptation was botany, science, learning how to do agriculture differently, more effectively, using more animals to till the soil, which meant that the plow could go deeper into the soil, using the animal manure to fertilize the soil, which had been done only very sparingly, because in the Middle Ages, agriculture had been done with only few animals and much more human labor. And now that changed, and therefore agriculture became more large-scale, agriculture became more professionalized, more commercialized. And you see that, for instance, also in Britain and elsewhere in Europe in the so-called enclosure of the commons, that the common land where landless poor people could let their animals feed and collect winter feed for these animals, etc. These commons, which used to be a medieval institution across much of Europe, were enclosed. That means the landless poor were chased off with their animals, and there was a fence or a wall was put around it, and sheep were grazed there for profit for the landowner, for wool, for the wool trade. And we see, so with the change in agriculture, we see a beginning of a different kind of economy, of a more capitalist economy, of an economy more built on trade, on important market towns, and, crucially, on a middle class. A middle class, people who live in cities and who can read and write and count. And these are the people you need to have this new economy, a professional class. But that, of course, also means that there is going to be social change. And that's exactly the change that I want to talk about today, because, well, there are direct consequences of a climate catastrophe or a change in climate. And we see these direct consequences in the fact that there were long, super cold winters, that there were failing harvests, that there was hunger. And then there are the more indirect adaptive consequences that something like that can have, such as, for instance, the beginning of European long-range trade, the beginning of science, and the beginning of a middle class. But then these changes also have their effects, and these are the cultural changes that are coming with a change of nature. And there's a surprising element here, because the change that the Little Ice Age is partly responsible for, and has certainly made easier, has certainly created a situation of almost urgency for. This change is, in a way, well, what this middle class does in order to also get some political participation, because that was important. People felt excluded from political decision-making, and, well, they were. The power was held by the church and the aristocracy, and if the middle class, which was newly rich and which held a lot of economic power and therefore also wanted to participate in political power, in decision-making about their own communities, well, this middle class didn't have the arguments to justify their claim for power that the aristocracy or the church had. The aristocracy effectively told other people, my family is older than yours. And the church effectively said, God loves us more than you do, than he loves you. And the middle class couldn't argue that. What the middle class could do, what these bourgeois people could do, the first people in the cities who were professionalized, was they could use a very, very old philosophical argument that had always been lying about, disregarded and gathering dust, but that had a truly world-busting, scandalous potential. And this idea was simply the idea that all humans are created equal, that all people are equal. Now, in order to realize from a perspective of today what that meant, you have to understand that in the 17th century and before, and for many people a lot after that as well, the vision of a decent society, of a good society, was built exactly on human inequality. Everybody knew that a Christian was better than a heathen, that an aristocrat was better than a peasant, that a man was better than a woman. And this was what the social order was built on. This was the central principle of order. And now there were a few cheeky authors popping up all across Europe, writing in often anonymous pamphlets, but sometimes also putting their name to it, if they could, if they lived in countries where that was possible, such as, for instance, Spinoza in the Netherlands, that people are equal, that there is no natural distinction between people, and that therefore, of course, the social order that exists, the political order, the distribution of political power that exists, is wrong and corrupt. So the mere idea of human equality was a direct attack on the political order. And that indeed is how it was treated. These people were persecuted, they were prosecuted, they were put in prison, they were burned, their books were burned. This was a dangerous idea. But this was also an idea that went much further, that had a reach that went much further, because this is, in effect, the beginning of the Enlightenment. The beginning of people saying, not only will we not divide our society according to some rules that we've inherited from some ancient time, from the Middle East, because there was a god who said this is how it has to be. We will take our fate into our own hands, our political fate into our own hands. But that also means that we, for ourselves, want to see what is the world actually made of. What position do we have in this world? What can we know about this world? And how should we live morally in a world if no God has ordained this morality for us? And these are the essential questions of the Enlightenment. And you will not be surprised to hear that these questions were put with a special force in the cities that were the great trading cities, that were the great market cities. Because, of course, if you have a market, you don't only exchange goods and money, you necessarily also exchange languages, cultures, approaches to the world, technologies, ways of doing things, ways of thinking, new ideas about how to run trade more efficiently, or how to educate the children, or how to treat people of other cultures, etc. And perhaps necessarily treat them with respect, because as trading partners, it becomes less important what they believe in, what God they believe in. If they keep their contract, they're good enough trading partners. And here is also a beginning of enlightened tolerance. Europe, the Europe of the Enlightenment, is an entirely different continent from the Europe of the late Middle Ages. And it is a Europe that has learned to adapt to the climate crisis. By the time the climate crisis itself, the little ice age, begins to recede, the temperatures start going up again, and by the early 19th century, most climate scientists say today that the little ice age had well and truly finished. But the period of adaptation was a period in which we don't only see changes in architecture, in clothing, or in the way that, well, what other changes do we see that are very fundamental at the time. Well, the things people eat, for instance. But we also see changes that are of a second and a third order, and we have changed societies now. There are societies in which markets have begun to rule, in which there's a very different dynamic. Indeed, there is a dynamic, because there are no longer societies which are strictly stratified, but all of a sudden you have people who are trying to punch through the different layers and rise up in society. So an enormous amount of change has taken place. Now, I said in the introduction to this series that I wanted to look at the difference that natural changes or any other kind of big changes can make to societies and how they live, but also to see whether there's anything that we can glean from that for the situation we're in ourselves, because we ourselves are in a climate crisis. We ourselves are fighting with 2 degrees of climate change, and if we look back, we can see how big the changes, not only for nature, but also for societies, were then. And I think we'd be wise to assume that the changes will be as big for us today. That, namely, just as in the late Middle Ages, there was a narrative, a way of doing things that no longer served the societies, that no longer brought the desired results, for instance, in agriculture, as the winters started to get longer. So I think we're relatively in the same point at the moment in terms of reacting to the climate crisis, because we're only reacting out of one narrative. We're still stuck in the same narrative that has, first of all, led us into this catastrophe, but that certainly no longer allows us to find a sensible way out of it. Our ways of the ways of the late Middle Ages were burning witches. We are today beginning with manipulating markets. We are beginning with emissions trading. We are beginning with trying to cultivate our supremacy over nature in some other way. We're talking about geoengineering on a large scale to manipulate natural systems. Or we talk about going to different planets to basically export the problem somewhere else. What we're not doing is thinking, how could we do things differently? Because just as a contract seemed to have been broken in the Middle Ages between God and society, perhaps now a contract has been broken, and that's a different contract, namely between markets and society. In the post-war era, Western societies have grown themselves out of every problem. Economic growth was the answer to poverty. Economic growth was the answer to more education, to more convenience, to more security, to more wealth. The problem is economic growth can no longer do that for us. As George Monbiot from The Guardian has pointed out, in a very simple maths example, if you have 3% of economic growth per year, that means that this economy will double every 24 years. And that will mean it will use hugely more raw materials to produce more products that really people don't much need, and will produce hugely more waste and toxins that are spewed into the environment. So it seems that economic growth is one of those parts of an old narrative that can no longer be part of a new solution. There are people who talk about green growth, but I do think that green growth is necessarily still linked to the same kind of processes and the same kind of problems. It may be mitigated, but it doesn't seem the solution for me. So just as medieval societies couldn't meaningfully react to climate change out of the system of late medieval thinking, out of a system of religious theological thinking about the relationship between God and his creatures, and societies had to adapt on a very large scale, changing their social organization eventually with the French Revolution, but also changing their economic way of doing things, their agriculture, their cultural assumptions, their societies. And this is also the beginning of large-scale urbanization. we see that the only way of adapting to the climate crisis was very fundamental adaptation. I think we are in a similar situation today. We can no longer meet this crisis out of the mentality of liberal markets that will solve the problem if left to themselves by economic growth. We necessarily need to find a different solution to these problems, a solution that starts with the fact that we cannot use more resources than there are for us to use, that we cannot interfere with natural systems more than they will stand. And ultimately, of course, and this perhaps is the most exciting aspect of this, that we ourselves are quite different creatures or beings than we thought we were, because the medieval way of doing things was based on man's, and I say that in this sexist way very consciously, man's domination over nature. And human domination over nature, or scientific domination over nature, is still with us and has become pretty much the central problem in our philosophical approach to also the climate crisis. We're beginning to learn that from seeing us as a completely exceptional being that is on this planet, because this planet is there for him, again in a very patriarchal way, to use and to abuse, to fulfill his historic and indeed theological destiny, that this vision no longer meets our needs of surviving on this planet. We will perhaps have another occasion of delving deeper into that, namely deeper into what comes after that, what philosophical revolutions come after that. I believe that we are really at the moment inside the greatest philosophical revolution also that humanity has ever undergone. But we will also look at the history of the Enlightenment and very much the flaws of the Enlightenment, perhaps even at a contemporary Enlightenment project that we may need and that is certainly worth discussing. I'm looking forward to talking to you about these things, but I'm also looking forward to hearing from you. Leave me your comments, visit me on Instagram, send me an email, visit my website, and tell me what you think. Tell me what interests you. Tell me what you don't understand or where you don't agree at all. Tell me what I should talk about, and I will try to react for that. For now, thanks for listening, and I hope to see you here back very soon.